Our next speaker should be very well known to this audience, given the venue, and that is Dr. Scott Pace, Director of the Space Policy Institute here at GW University. He also, I love this title, he is a Professor of the Practice of International Affairs. I haven't seen that title before.
It means you'll never get tenure. It's too practical.
All right, so Scott is another person in our community who has a broad range of experience. So before coming to the Space Policy Institute at George Washington University, he was at NASA, and he had a variety of roles during his career at NASA. He was our Associate Administrator for Program Analysis and Evaluation, so being that independent check and looking at alternatives and doing studies for us. For a time, he was our Chief Technologist in Space Communications in the organization where I currently work. And he also served as a Deputy Chief of Staff to the NASA Administrator, Sean O'Keefe. Prior to coming to NASA, he was the Assistant Director for Space and Aeronautics in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And prior to that, he was with RAND Corporation in their Science and Technology Policy Institute. You can see, and before that, with the Office of Space Commerce in the Department of Commerce. So he has a range of experience in government and academia, think tanks, and across a range of issues, including civil, commercial, and national security space, and management of technical innovation. So, Scott, your turn to give us your thoughts.
Thank you. And I started off working as a lab technician at JPL, and where my overtime hours were cut in the 1970s to pay for shuttle cost overruns. Not that I'm bitter about that or anything. Thank you. This is a great panel. I'm honored to be on it with these colleagues. On the issue of governance, from a U.S. perspective, there's been an evolution in how we do international cooperation. The Apollo program was largely a U.S. effort. U.S. only, that was sort of the whole point of it. The shuttle program was, of course, U.S.-led and directed, although it had international contributions, the European Space Lab, Canadian Arm, the excuse me, I'm still recovering a bit. Excuse me, geez. The International Space Station started off as another U.S.-led effort with international partners, but with the arrival of Russia, it became a truly balanced international partnership. It was not something where any one partner could dictate a result. And so as we look for going beyond the International Space Station and thinking about Mars and so forth, you look at the results of the Global Exploration Strategy, you see that the U.S. is looking at involving potential partners at a very, very early age, not just simply inviting them to contribute parts and components or to share in a particular mission or to be a partner in a particular activity, even a large, ambitious facility such as the space station, but really as part of the architecture. And so this is, I think, a very, very natural evolution, and I would think that the International Space Station is probably the last major space project that one could envision any one country even possibly contemplating doing on its own. I don't think space station would have existed without the international partners, and I think anything more ambitious than that will certainly require international partners. Now, there are other international cooperative activities that have different governance mechanisms that have been mentioned. You can think of things like the Large Hadron Collider. You can think of things like operations in Antarctica, major complex military programs such as the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter that have ranges of partners, lots and lots of money, exist over many, many years, very technically challenging. But I think the space station is probably in a class by itself in terms of the complexities that it's had to deal with. The problem is that when we look at exploration activities more broadly, single large facilities, of which the space station is an exemplar, are not likely to be the only thing we'll have out there. I can imagine the ISS structure and intergovernmental agreements applying to a partnership, say, for a lunar-based facility. But I have trouble imagining even a single lunar-based facility really encompassing all that we would be doing on the moon. It might be, say, on the South Pole, but we'd want to visit other parts of the moon, so we'd want to have other outposts. We could imagine individual countries deciding, well, I'm going to do an outpost at this location, but I'm also going to be a partner with you, say, at a larger single facility on the South Pole. I can imagine partners coming together to build a an interplanetary vehicle, whether robotic or human, and they would have a bilateral or a small multilateral relationship, but that others would have their own relationships and have their own capabilities and vehicles. So when we look at architectures, we need to imagine a wider variety of structures, of which then the space station would just simply be one possible model. In terms of the no exchange of funds, I think that served government partnerships very, very well. But of course, it's not the case in the private sector. And one of the things that, in talking about the vision for space exploration and some of the earlier panels that you've heard today, is that the private sector and commercial industry wants to see and sees an opportunity to play a much, much larger role. And of course, they want to be paid. They want to see what is the business case for that. There's a small case for supporting the International Space Station right now. I think there's a potentially larger case for, say, cargo facilities going to the moon. I'm not sure what the business case is for Mars yet, but I'm sure someone will have one. And when we look at that, we realize that governance has to involve how do we interact with these private sector entities. I mean, the Intergovernmental Agreement on Space Station is sort of simple in that at least it's all sovereign states that have come together. Now, the 1967 Outer Space Treaty says that member states, following the treaty, are also responsible for the activities of their nationals, that is, persons subject to their jurisdiction or control. Now, the way that's traditionally carried out is through licensing. So when the FAA, Commercial Transportation Office, does a launch license, or when NOAA issues a remote sensing license, or when FCC issues a satellite license, that's not done simply because we like to employ bureaucrats, although maybe only for a day or two more, to do these activities. It's because it's part of our international commitment in the 1967 Outer Space Treaty that we exercise oversight of persons subject to our jurisdiction or control. So for governance is what is the process? What is the licensing process? What are the modifications that would be made such that as more and more commercial people and private sector people are involved in these activities, how do we make sure that we're in compliance with international law, but not doing so in a very heavy-handed way that would limit those activities really only to national space agencies or other government entities. This is not a purely hypothetical problem, because if you look at for some of you familiar with it, the 1979 Moon Treaty, which is the last of 5 major international space treaties that were developed through the Committee on Peaceable Uses of Outer Space. And it is, as our Soviet friends used to say, it is no accident that there hasn't been another one, because the 79 Moon Treaty was a massive failure. It was not signed by really any major spacefaring state. No one really accedes to it, and it's an interesting academic exercise for some of my space law colleagues, but it's largely a failure. And the primary reason it was a failure is it attempted overreach. It attempted to regulate private sector entities in extremely heavy-handed ways. For any of you who are so inclined, if you simply look up Article 11, which talks about how any profits or any resources that were developed together had to be shared with some unspecified UN entity, that would, be the biggest socialist nightmare you can imagine. It was a product of a different time. So what's happened since that time is governance has developed in a more bottom-up, voluntary practices. So if you look at things like the guidelines for the mitigation of orbital debris, you see that as a technical best practice built bottom-up based on experience. If you look at international standards, Consultative Committee on Space Data Standards, which enables the rovers on Mars to talk with both the orbiting European orbiter as well as an orbiting American orbiter, that's because they both use CCDS open standards that were developed by technical experts, and again, a bottom-up approach, not a top-down heavy governance structure. So as we look toward future governance, we try to involve the private sector. We should be cautious not to repeat, I think, some mistakes of the past. We should pay attention to experience in actual flight and the real world. And to Andreas's, I think, point about developing the political will, I think it's important to keep in mind that the lunar program, the Apollo program, was an answer not to a technical question, but to a political question. President Kennedy was looking for, is there anything anywhere we can beat the Soviets at? Because life is really bad. And the lunar program and doing it within a year was an answer to a political question. It was not because President Kennedy was a space enthusiast. And my colleague, Dr. Logston, has a whole book on it. I commend it to you. I don't get any royalties, but it's a great book. And so the question today is, what's the question for which human spaceflight is the answer? Now, among people in this room, the answer is, well, the answer is human spaceflight. What was the question? And I think we need to steal a page from our science colleagues who are very good at asking large, overarching questions and then chaining them down into specific programmatic activities. Now, exploration is not science. I absolutely stress that. But I think the practice of asking questions, or grand questions, to then organize our thoughts and our architectures can play a very helpful role in ensuring the sustainability of our space activities, which is probably the biggest single challenge. And political will is an aspect of that, but the sustainability such that we don't pull our entire program up by the roots and re-examine it every time we have an election. We don't do that to the astrophysics program. We don't do that to the U.S. Navy. We may change the amount of funding we spend on it. We may change the goals and priorities. We may insert new technologies. We may stop old programs. But we don't have this kind of existential debate about why we have this program. And absent a Cold War competition, which I think no one wants to see come back, I think that the community would do well to start prioritizing and structuring questions, things like in situ resource utilization, long-term sustainment off the planet, what can we do in exploring in and around the moon, and building up in a gradual. What questions are we answering to which we can then trade other technical concepts against them? And I think if we can have that idea of a set of sustainable questions that go for longer than a political cycle, I think we can have a more sustainable human spaceflight program, and then the question of governance of the different aspects of it will fall out, I think, fairly naturally.